And thanks for everyone for joining us. My name is Jason Sarsfield. I'm the Deputy Director at the Center for Charter Schools at Central Michigan University. Um, we engaged Adam and Dave on behalf of the Learning Collective and Venn Education, respectively, a couple of months ago. And we felt it was important to engage a trusted third party to conduct an objective inquiry around what's been working, what's not been working, what's changed, what hasn't changed throughout the pandemic with regard to educational programs. And they did this through a series of surveys and focus group discussions across the 57 charter schools in our portfolio here in Michigan. And we've held 2 of these sessions already this week, exclusively for our partners within those 57 schools. And we're really excited to be able to offer this opportunity for really any interested party to join us for a discussion today and to learn what Adam and Dave have learned throughout this inquiry. I'd like to just start by also thanking Joe Marr and Aaron Conley, colleagues of mine at the center here at CMU, for their leadership and participation throughout the project in terms of helping things, giving feedback to Adam and Dave, et cetera. So their contributions, we're grateful for. So thank you. Thank you also to those of you that are joining within the CMU kind of family of sorts, both internal team members as well as folks in the schools. And then lastly, again, welcome to everyone. It's great to see some familiar faces, some new faces from around the country. With that, this is Adam and Dave's work, so I'm going to step back and let them share, and I'll join in with some questions as well as the rest of the group when that time is right. Dave, you want to take it away?
No problem. Thanks, Jason. Similarly, just want to extend a thanks to Jason, Janelle, who's behind the scenes, Joe and Aaron from CMU for their great work and collaboration through this process. My name is David Hartman. I lead the Venn Education and kind of working in this space for many, many years. It's great to be with you today. We're really excited to share the findings from this report. Adam?
Hi, everyone. I'm Adam Aberman, run the Learning Collective education consulting company established in 2003. Enjoyed working with Dave on this project. We learned a lot, and as Dave said, there's a lot of information we're sharing with you. And Dave will take you through, talk about the methodology and the findings, and then I will talk about the recommendations, and then we'll have a Q&A at the end, and really looking forward to hearing your questions and feedback at the end of the session. Appreciate your time today.
So as we mentioned, you can use the chat feature if anything comes up. We'll try when I'm presenting, Adam will be on there monitoring it and vice versa. So we'll try to respond in time. We'll reserve the last 15 minutes for questions. This is being recorded right now, so just know that that's happening, and it'll be a URL will be sent around after the fact if you want to access it or share it with others. So in terms of the context, I always look at March 13th, 2020 as an important day. So that was the day of the national emergency being declared by the president. And really, none of us really had any idea. And we all know this, that we all thought this would be much, much shorter and didn't really know what lied ahead. We all wondered, how would we work? What about our families, and what about our communities, whether it's the extended community and or the school itself? But the one thing that was really common across everything and all the conversations we had was everybody was trying their best. And we learned a lot from everybody trying to do that. Schools had no choice but to respond, and every aspect of schools within schools themselves were challenged, right? So thinking about methodology, communication, mental health, we'll talk about all of those things, but everything, the foundation was shaken. So it's become clear that schools may never return to normal or what preceded the 13th of March, 2020. And basically we engaged to figure out what happened between then and now and what we can learn. So we conducted this project to learn about how methods methods of instruction, staffing, student and staff mental health have changed in the last 2 years, what schools have done specifically. And our report, it's posted in the chat. We'll distribute it later. There's a URL there. We have hundreds of findings. We won't share every single one of those findings, nor will we identify all 65 of the recommendations in this presentation. But we're going to kind of pull some of the high-level pieces, pique your curiosity, and hopefully bring about a conversation. But all this is intended for schools to help them to plan and prepare for the 22-23 school year. So we're really excited to share this information. So we went about this. I'll just talk 2 or 3 slides just about how we did it before really starting with our findings. So we engaged in research in March, kind of looking at a lot of things that many of you probably have looked at, and looking some specifically in Michigan, since this is for CMU, but looking nationally at what people were learning, writing about, and sharing. We engaged in 2 rounds of interviews and surveys with the whole portfolio of CMU's schools. We've now published the report and we're sharing this information out. Really happy to do it. So the focus group themselves, we convened 18 of them. These are the 6 different types of focus groups that we engaged with. And you can see how many hours of focus group time we devoted to this. We had 81 responses to the surveys, and you can see the breakdown of who responded to the first survey and kind of what the different breakdowns. I mean, bottom line on all of this is we really wanted a representative example to get different perspectives on how people were affected, what they did, and what type of things were successful or not. So in the end, we have a 43-page report organized into 7 categories. We didn't start with these 7 categories. We started with a number of questions, which are listed in the bottom of the report. But basically, this is what rose to the top, are these 7 categories of information. Some are more substantial than others based on the feedback that we gleaned from people. It's organized into findings and recommendations, as will the next couple of minutes of what we share. Oh, and the last piece is there are links to all of the pieces of research that we engaged in. So if you find anything through there that piques your interest, you'll be able to find the source of it in the report itself and find it for yourself. So to talk about the first set of findings, there's unfinished learning and unfinished instruction over the course of the last 2 years. Not really new news to any of you, but just really to kind of level set where we are. Significant more damage to students' long-term academic progress than natural disasters. So just to level set how big of the impact, some people are saying as big as a hurricane or bigger. What we saw first, both CMU's data and then national data confirms this, that there was a drop in math scores right away in fall of 2020, reading scores followed by spring of 21. Gaps when it comes to income, 20% greater in math and 15% greater in reading. Majority Black schools were up to 6 months behind. And then this last piece about dropouts. The estimation of the long-term effect is that high school age students, there could be an increase of more than 500,000 to 1.2 million additional dropouts by estimates based on the pandemic itself. So huge effect, not new news to you, but just level setting how great it is. Some of the findings that we received, so remote learning had greater negative effect on math and ELA achievement, especially in lower grades. So what we heard from people is that because literacy is so important, and if there wasn't good, well-established reading ability, that the impact was greater at the lower grades. Many schools deem their hybrid learning ineffective. And then flipped classrooms, which is taking content and consuming it outside of school and then practicing it within your school, was inconsistent as an effect. Some teachers recorded their lessons for reuse for themselves or other teachers in schools. So this is a really positive thing that we found kind of novel, is that people didn't anticipate that they were creating a lot of curricular assets by going to remote learning. One primary learning from the pandemic and remote learning is the importance of cognitive, interpersonal, emotional development, and the desire of stakeholders to prioritize student well-being as well as a means to increase students' ability to learn. So I'll just pause on that one for a second. This was the most common thing that people came to focus groups and surveys with, is that the cognitive, interpersonal, emotional development of students and the mental health effect on adults was profound, and that there was a challenge to focus on all of that effectively in schools. Additionally, some school leaders identified that establishing a healthy adult relationships was a really high priority, and they were surprised by that. So that's why they pointed out is that the effects on mental health extended beyond the students, and the effects are pretty great. Many people talked about the challenge they're facing ending this school year and losing a number of adults, or anticipating they're going to lose a number of adults going into the next school year based on those things. Within instructional leadership, you can see the pie chart on the right. Survey respondents said, 3/4 said that they would benefit from hiring additional instructional coaches in the next year. Investments in instructional coaches and leaders since 2020 have been widespread and appreciated by teachers. So I think we attribute that to a lot of the federal dollars that have gone in, but it is not limited to federal dollars. A lot of people just decided and saw that there was a specific need to increase the support for teachers as we changed methods. Many education service providers created networks for leaders to learn from each other. So another thing we heard was that leaders, whether it's instructional leaders or school leaders, felt isolated. And so some networks of schools developed electronic means in order to create networks to support those people who were feeling isolated. Teacher planning and support. So teacher collaboration, nearly every focus group, especially of teachers, but school leaders, talked about how there was such a need. And I think some of it initially was around the isolation that people felt. They weren't around their peers. They weren't able to have the in-between conversations and the additional responsibilities. And so it really kind of pushed people at the edges and identified the need for people to have the professional time to do it, and then just the space to talk about their practice. So a couple of examples and there are a lot of schools that already have these things in place, and frankly, a lot of these findings reflect just best practice. But really what it was is it kind of focused people back to why they're doing these things, or if they've kind of moved away from them, that they need to refocus on these things. So two of these things were teacher free time during the workday, co-scheduling that time. So if there are groups of teachers, whether it's PLCs or just open time, that we encourage them to collaborate during that time. The other is kind of a novel idea of a school that had, I think it was a Friday half day in which students were released and there was either PD or teacher work time. they actually started to pay for the teachers to go offsite for lunch in advance of teacher collaboration. And what they found was affording them that space to kind of clear their heads before then they came back to teacher collaboration had a really positive effect. In terms of communication, some have expanded who they listen to and included all school stakeholders. Just before this meeting, I just had come out of another session in which people were talking about retaining connections to their community and really, really listening to the needs and reflecting those needs. One in that group, and what we heard from people in focus groups, was including students in that and making sure that student voice is proactively asked for throughout the process. And a lot of people said that once they started to do that, they started to hear things that they didn't anticipate or they had kind of forgotten about. Some schools used weekly surveys or other social media to communicate and learn from their constituents. So one of the things is that in the absence, this is immediately with remote learning, in the absence of the ability to pull everybody together in one room or to pronounce something over the audio loudspeaker, they had to rely on these means to collect information. And now it's become more normal. One caveat on the weekly survey that we heard from a couple school leaders was to be very specific and pare down that information. So for example, just asking one question per week, because you don't want to ask more questions than you're ever going to report back to people. You always want to be able to show what it is. So people were, need to show responsiveness, and it was using those electronic means that many people weren't relying on as much to get good information. Finally, in this one, remote parent-teacher conferences are reportedly well attended. So in some instances, parent-teacher conference participation went from 50% pre-pandemic to 90%. What we've heard from a lot of schools is that they hadn't considered doing this in the past, and they may not only do remote into the future, but they will include that as one of the options, either within the amount of time that those parent-teacher conferences exist on their schedule, or to expand that time to accommodate people's schedules. But just again, leveraging technology in order to improve their connection to the community. Budget-wise, some schools report that teacher morale is lower than in the years past, despite additional teacher bonuses. So what we heard from people is that giving a dollar bonus to people may not have the effect that some schools or boards intended. So whether it was $2,000, $4,000, or $10,000, whether it is inflation that has kind of filled in the gap, and so people don't see it as an incentive to motivate or be a real reward, that some people were surprised that filling that gap really didn't satisfy people's needs or motivate them to change when it comes to staff and teachers. So some people talked about adjusting insurance rates or 401k contributions, really thinking about what are the other pieces of compensation or the other things that have high value to teachers that might help them feel like they're supported and they're getting good compensation for the work that they do. Another thing when it comes to budgeting is that ESSER funds will sunset in the next 2 years. And some people have hired social workers with those dollars, but they're now transitioning those dollars into long-term budget and not relying on those ESSER funds, because they're starting to realize, back to the cognitive, interpersonal, emotional development need, that, for instance, a school social worker or an additional school social worker is of such high value that they're going to budget to use that not just with pandemic relief dollars. Since ESSER funds became available, there's been an increase in the number of vendors. And so a lot of schools and school leaders and board members said, oh, there are all these people reaching out, offering their services because there's all this additional money that's come in from the federal government. And some school leaders and board members expressed, we really don't even have a way to consider or vet, whether or not these people are of the quality that they say. They come in and say, oh, well, we know you have this money and we've done this for the school. We can make you great in these ways. And so there was a challenge that school leaders and board members expressed in having or being able to effectively deal with people coming to them this way. There are 2 more slides here on findings, and then we'll transition to recommendations. Accountability. Some school leaders are concerned that a reduction in accountability for teachers has hampered school learning. So not all, but some schools talked about how some of them framed it in terms of grace and respect, or just the ability for people to execute in their space, that the expectations that school leaders, boards had of teachers within their school were kind of reduced over the course of the last 2 years. They also expressed in that same breath that it has hampered student learning, right? So they haven't been able to support high quality instruction in the ways that they would like or they had pre-pandemic. Next bullet is the converse. Some schools have made accountability measures more explicit for leaders and staff with quarterly developmental evaluations, and you can read everything there. And so what we're finding is that people, back to that first slide, people are trying to do their best. They're trying to figure out what works right. And frankly, what we heard is that this is reflective of culture in the particular school. In the end, it's about what works best to increase student learning and following the data. And some people have said their attempts didn't really merit the increases in student learning that they were hoping. The last 2, some research suggests the importance of student portfolios during this era of substantial unfinished learning. So really diversify the way in which students can show what they know or mastery. And so a lot of schools, this has given them an opportunity to think more in that direction. Moving over to Google Classroom or other electronic means has kind of consolidated a lot of academic work into one space. And so people are able to look at things more like portfolios rather than an individual assessment. So that's opened a little bit of thinking for some schools. And then finally, specific to Central Michigan University, some people expressed that they found turnover in leads and liaisons. So from an authorizer perspective, the people who are interacting with school leaders and boards, that those transitions have been difficult to navigate. So whether that has to do or was an effect of going more remote and not having that direct relationship, we don't know. But we do know that over the course of the last 2 years, that has been a challenge that came out in the CMU portfolio. Last slide on findings. So in terms of schools operating consistent with their mission and vision, when we surveyed people, we didn't do pre and post tests. This is just asking them to reflect at one point and think about pre-pandemic and current status. They did say that 92% of schools, the survey respondents said, were consistently following their mission and vision in 2019, and that they self-report as having fewer operating consistent with their mission and vision in spring of 2022. Schools have recognized the need for cognitive, interpersonal, emotional development supports, and that those haven't always been regarded in strategic plans or with much strategy. People talk about culture as this thing we should do, but it is not listed up there with the academic or financial strategies that schools identify. Some schools have reacted to the needs the last 2 years by adding programming and or staff responsibility without eliminating programming. So basically, people have been asked to do more, and there hasn't been backfilling with staff. Some of that is reflective of everybody's responding and trying to do their best, and no surprise, there are staffing issues. And so being able to fulfill or fill all of the positions, whether they're teacher positions or staff positions, has really pushed the focus to fill everybody's plate. And that has, as people have identified, had a negative effect. It's a hard thing. And then finally, boards and board training and development. Some boards over the course of the last 2 years pause this focus. And so we're not training as much as they were beforehand. And Adam's going to talk a little bit about what we found and would recommend in terms of people affected within that cohort. Adam?
All right. Thank you very much, Dave. Now time for your sip of water. So we're really excited to share with you some of the, I should say, these are some of the recommendations that we have based on those findings, and to kind of further frame and couch those, the kind of 5 themes you'll see throughout these, the findings and the recommendations is need to develop goals and action steps regarding cognitive, interpersonal, emotional development, teacher collaboration, the need to listen to all stakeholders, the focus on growth, so not just absolute proficiency or absolute attainment, but the focus on growth, and then the notion of unfinished learning and unfinished instruction. So you'll kind of hear those themes throughout these recommendations. Again, we have 65 recommendations in the report. We're just sharing less than half of those with you. So we do encourage you to spend time, if you can, to look at that report. So some recommendations regarding education programming. So there are quite a few cohorts of individuals that were particularly affected by the pandemic. So, for example, there are all of those students that started school during remote learning and in the last couple years, teachers that started teaching during that time, or teachers who went through their teacher training during that time, board members who joined boards during that time, and even schools that started working with educational service providers at that time. These are all cohorts that started or formed during remote learning or shortly thereafter. And so they're going to have particular needs. So one recommendation is we encourage all schools to develop a plan to monitor and provide additional differentiated support for each one of those cohorts. One thing we also found, and this is from surveys and focus groups, is we asked, what type of support did you find that was most helpful for students? Was it tutoring? Was it small groups? Was it after-school programs? There's more research about after-school programs in the report. But the clear feedback from surveys and focus groups was that small groups were reportedly the most effective way to accelerate learning. And so our recommendation accordingly is to really think about how small groups of students are being used at your school or group of schools, the frequency with which they're being used, is appropriate differentiation occurring during those small groups, and are you getting data from those small groups to assess, are these groups having the effect that you want? I would say a close second, well, not a close second, but kind of second was tutoring. But some schools realized that one issue with tutoring is you don't always get data from tutors from the extent to which tutoring is having the desired impact on students. So really think about how small groups are being used at your school going into next school year. So there's a lot here around cognitive, interpersonal, emotional development. But the first sentence here on the first bullet is not our words. It came from one of our focus group attendees, but go slow to go fast. there is really, we suggest the beginning of the school year, several schools did this last school year, coming back from remote learning. And because unfinished learning and unfinished instruction is going to continue significantly into next year, it wasn't all addressed and ameliorated in this last school year that's just ending. We definitely suggest taking time at the beginning of the school year to really focus on building a strong culture that's supporting the CIED needs of students. When thinking about, as I mentioned kind of in the lead up, when thinking about CIED and even academic efforts, to really focus on the growth of students. So not so much thinking about our kids, are they achieving absolutely what they should be, or are they at absolute proficiency, but are they showing significant growth? And that's not only academically, but if schools are actually using quantitative measures to track the CIED needs of kids, to focus on the growth that those measures are showing, that the results of those measures are showing. Also, we suggest that schools get the input from an array of stakeholders to establish school-wide CIED standards. And that when establishing these standards, that whoever's involved in establishing those standards should reflect the racial and demographic composition of the students at that school, and that students also play a role in developing that plan. Get into a little bit later how important it is to listen to everyone at this time, because we're still learning what's needed. It's just really important to, especially in middle and high school, to make sure you get input from students when developing these standards. And so once these standards are developed, to monitor and track the extent to which these standards are being met, and to utilize multiple measures to do so, and to really think about it in quantitative ways. So not just getting kind of ad hoc feedback from folks when you're kind of passing the hallway, but to think about really concrete, again, quantitative ways to track, are these standards being met? Then to implement that program throughout the school year next year, so that at the end of next year, just like in good schools, good academic data on individual students will be shared from teacher to teacher across, at the end of one school year going to the next school year. So if you have good data on CIED programming, what's working, what's not working, and you have good data on the individual needs of kids in terms of their mental well-being, the well-being and their mental health, that data can be shared from teacher to teacher at the end of next year, so that the following year, teachers know exactly, or have a very good sense of what those kids' needs are. Next one. Thank you. So in terms of instructional leadership, certainly we suggest continuing to support instruction and teacher retention by hiring an adequate number of instructional leaders. And when you hire and when you have an adequate number of these instructional leaders, to really make sure, if you're going to pay money to have these additional folks, is to make sure that they are focused exclusively on instruction. It's very easy to get, as everyone knows who's run a school or worked at a school, it's very easy for leaders to get caught up in other important matters that are not directly related to instruction. But these folks that are there hired to provide instructional support should stay completely and exclusively focused on that. So making sure they're participating in grade level meetings that are happening daily, or department meetings that are happening daily, or regularly leading PD. To support leaders, we recommend hiring executive coaches to support leaders. And for schools that maybe schools that are part of an ESP network, sometimes they could tap in their resources there to tap in to get support. But for independently run schools, there aren't always those resources. So we suggest that charter schools potentially collaborate with other charter schools to invest in finding leadership coaches. And I should say, I know that there's some folks on this webinar that are not even work in public schools or even parochial schools. This is something it's not necessarily just limited to charter schools. But also one more thing there, Dave, and for those folks that are, those schools that are in more remote, in more rural situations, you could also consider, using a remote leadership coach. That could be effective too. Excuse me. Certainly prioritize providing structured weekly time for teacher collaboration. As Dave mentioned before, this really, among other things, helps with teacher retention. And one of the reasons is because it just makes teachers better at their craft and helps them with their happiness. So certainly structured time as much as possible, structure that time based on data analysis, both academically and regarding CIED. Providing opportunities for veteran teachers to mentor less experienced teachers. We did hear from focus groups, and the research also bears this out somewhat, is that more teachers are retiring, so we have more younger teachers coming into the profession. So a greater need to have veteran teachers mentor less experienced teachers. This last bullet here, the suggestion is for counselors that are on the school site to consider availing those counselors' time, not just for kids, but for adults. So if there are staff that for whatever reason may want to access a counselor, to make that a possibility. And it's, there is still a stigma, potentially a stigma with, folks seeking out support for well-being, for adults to seek out support for well-being or mental health. But we believe that over time that stigma will start to diminish, and something like this, what's mentioned this last bullet, will seem more normal and acceptable. And just think of it as even as a school nurse. So if there were a staff member that were injured or something on campus, maybe that staff member could see a school nurse or get aspirin from a school nurse or something. But kind of something akin to that, where staff member could use these counseling services. Next slide. Thanks. So communications. So listening. So one thing that came out as a really clear theme was the importance to listen to all stakeholders as we try to figure out how best to do things. So what we suggest is what this first bullet refers to is to listen to all stakeholders. So establish structures and systems to do so through surveys or focus groups, even looking at social media, and then to communicate to stakeholders what was learned through that listening, develop plans and action steps based on what was learned through listening, and then report out to stakeholders the success and how effective those plans were based on their input. So just really want to stress that, and this is, again, going into next school year, the importance to set up structures and systems for listening to all, and including students. And one way is that second bullet Dave talked about a little bit earlier, were electronic surveys, especially for teachers to understand their needs and desires. There were a couple of schools that in 2020 and even into the fall of 2020 really used weekly surveys with teachers as they're still trying to figure out how to conduct remote learning, but other things surfaced through those surveys. And some of these schools wish they had actually not moved away from those weekly surveys of teachers. I wish they'd continue with them. Give parents the options to attend parent-teacher conferences remotely. Still continue with the in-person parent conferences when able to, but give parents the option to also attend remotely. It's better for parents to attend remotely than not to attend at all, and to stream board meetings. So some charter schools are doing this already, but if you're not, we suggest streaming board meetings as a way to give parents an opportunity, and others and teachers an opportunity to attend board meetings regularly, or at least to observe them. So for the regarding budget, so create and budget for CIED, again, cognitive, interpersonal, emotional development, school-wide programming for next year. So just be very deliberate and about that. Also create a deliberate plan with particular action steps to improve teacher well-being and retention. So we learn from schools, as Dave kind of touched on, that there are a lot of discussions about how teachers want to, many discussions about what could happen to promote teacher retention, or what could happen, what could be done at the school to make teachers happy with what they're doing. But not just to stop at those conversations, but to actually develop a written plan on how to, and with particular action steps on how to encourage that well-being and teacher retention. And that could be, but not exclusively to, based on teacher compensation or increased compensation. Think about ESSER funds, prioritizing them on one-time expenditures to support accelerated student learning. And with these vendors that, these numbers of vendors that have been, the increased number of vendors that have been approaching schools as of late, establish systems or committees or rubrics to evaluate these vendor offerings, require vendors to provide research-based evidence on the effectiveness of their offerings. There was one stakeholder that communicated a study to us that in one study of educational software, that only 10% of educational software was actually tested on kids prior to going to market. So if that study is valid and reliable and is actually pertains to many educational softwares, that's very problematic. So ask for their evidence on the effectiveness of their program, and also when you learn about vendors, and if you develop these rubrics, or you learn particular things about vendors or research about them, please share that with other schools as they're going through the same thing, trying to figure out what are the right third parties to support what they do. So don't keep it a secret, please share it. Accountability. So was mentioned a couple times, but just calling it out again. Really think about focusing on, when you're thinking about accountability, and accountability not just for academics, but accountability for cognitive, interpersonal, emotional development, CIED. Think about it and measure it. Focus on growth for next year. Don't think about, rather than focusing on absolute proficiency or grade level proficiency, focus on growth, because there's still the accelerated learning, and there's still a great need for that. And there's a lot of unfinished learning and unfinished instruction that's still in place. One thing, actually, give me 1 second. I'm going to put a link into the chat here. Okay, so this link is to support that second bullet. So when measuring, when monitoring, measuring, so when thinking about accountability next year, going in for next school year, don't just think about outcomes. Think about inputs, and include that in how you're measuring success. And those inputs should be research-based. So, for example, think about differentiated instruction is an input, is a strategy used at schools. Fidelity to curriculum, implementing what is learned in PD. So these are examples of inputs that are research-based, and we suggest that you actually go up there. Yep. A second.
Sorry.
No problem. So we suggest that you, when you're thinking about success at your school next year, that you think about, you measure the extent to which teachers and others are producing or affecting or implementing these inputs. So that link I just gave, I put in the chat, is a pretty long document listing a lot of, it's not an exhaustive list, but it's what a lot of these research-based inputs are. A lot of them will not be news to you, but I wanted to just put that out there for you. That link is also in the report, but wanted to include that as examples of what these inputs could be. But measure the extent to which those are executed next year. Diversifying assessment methods to ensure student achievement and growth through multiple means. So think about, assessment results, portfolio performance, and is the school meeting its mission-specific goals? So accountability in multiple means. Next slide. So last slide on recommendations before we leave it up for Q&A. If your school is not already, engage in strategic planning as soon as possible. And when we think of strategic planning, I mean, that could certainly take many forms. One form is a written document that has goals and very specific and measurable goals and action steps to support it. And if your school already has a strategic plan, and if you haven't revisited it yet, we certainly suggest you do so to adjust as necessary based on the current circumstances over the last couple of years. Lastly, and also, but I would say also importantly, especially for middle and high schools, make sure that students are part of strategic planning. There's actually someone, a representative of a school that later this month we're in New York that I'm going to be facilitating strategic planning with, and it's a K-8 school, but we're going to be probably more deliberate than in years past to make sure that we get student input on the goals, the action steps, the mission and vision of the school. So we're having various focus groups of students to get that input. So these are unique times. Students are having unique experiences, and it's important to learn from them. So that's a lot of information, but we're really curious to see if you have any questions or ideas or comments you want to share. I think Jason may have a question to put out there or a comment, but really we have good 10, 12 minutes left, and really would love to hear back from all of you.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Really valuable. And also for the participants, we'll follow up with some information as well as contact information if you have questions afterwards. Clearly, one of the challenges that's gotten a lot worse throughout the pandemic is staffing, and staffing across the country, teachers, support staff, leaders. Can you guys, you touched upon this a little bit when you talked about compensation strategies. But can you talk about any creative or effective strategies that you heard around teacher recruitment and retention particularly?
Go ahead, Adam, if you got it.
Yeah, so a couple things regarding teacher retention, and Dave will probably add to this, but as we mentioned once or twice, is that offering opportunities for teachers to collaborate with each other, frequent, regular opportunities, structured, and sometimes even unstructured opportunities. It was a real way we heard from teachers and from folks who work at schools through surveys and focus groups. That's a really important mechanism to promote teacher growth and teacher retention, and also opportunities to listen. There was one school that every week there's an open opportunity, kind of an open forum where all teachers and staff gather without an agenda, just to talk about what their particular needs are, just anything that they want to talk about. I think it's a half an hour every week. 3 of those sessions are led by the school leader. So the school leader is present, the school leader listens to what some of those concerns are. But one of those sessions is the school leader doesn't even attend. So it's just an open session to hear from each other about the needs and desires. So that's just an example of listen. And in that school, that school, I believe, has done a good job of retaining its teachers going into next school year. So that's just one example of how listening to teachers can really promote teacher retention.
And I'll just touch on that and say that everybody's struggling with recruitment right now. Like staffing is a major issue across the country. We've heard that. We're well aware of that. 2 things that we heard. One was that a number of schools and school leaders talked about substitute teachers. So in some particular states, the ability to kind of bring in anybody with a BA to serve as a sub was seen as a really good opportunity. Some of those school leaders, not all, but some said that risk was too great. What they found were it was more work to manage somebody who didn't have the experience, but they had that BA. And so to implicit in that is to keep your standards high. The other thing that we heard was if you need to, my words, lower your standards, right? So bring more people in who are less credentialed, that you need to counter that with more professional development, support, and instructional leadership, right? So if you're not able to recruit effectively, make sure that you build into your budget your ability to support those people and have proactive professional development opportunities, not opportunities, but requirements for them in order to execute in the ways that you would expect them to.